Before I begin, I want to thank Fran and Marty Cedar for sponsoring this week's Dvar Torah. So I want to tell you a story. The story is about a young Jew who had enough of religion, was ready to throw it all away, and he became quite fond of the local Apikoros. So he approached him and said, "I'd like to learn more about what you do." The Apikoros said, "Sure, why don't you come to my house for Shabbos?" Perplexed that the Apikoros called it Shabbos and not Saturday, he obliged. He shows up at the house right before Shabbos. He sees the candles are set, the table is set, the Kiddush cup is there, the challah is there. He goes through the meal, they go to shul, they daven, he hears Kiddush, motzi, they bench, they sing Zmiros, Malava Malka, Motzi Shabbos, they have on Oneg Shabbos Friday, the whole 9 yards, every chumrah is kept on Shabbos. And finally, following the Malava Malka, after Havdalah, the young Jew says to the Apikoros, "I don't understand what this was all about. You're the Apikoros. I'm supposed to have a different experience than what I get at home." The Apikoros turned to the young man and said, "Young man, I'm an Apikoros. I'm not an ignoramus." And I love that story because in many ways, I admire the Apikoros, whereas I pity the Amaretz, the ignoramus. See, at least the Apikoros has had a chance to get involved, to plumb the depths, to understand, to study what God and the connection to Yiddishkeit is all about. The Amaretz never opened his or her eyes to something so beautiful, to the potential. Of course, I wish for the Apikoros to change his or her ways as well. But there's something to be said about the willingness to be open to things, to open their hearts and minds. And that story always catches my attention when we get to the mitzvah of Bal Tashchis. In this week's parsha, we learn about the prohibition not to chop down a fruit-bearing tree, which has now evolved into not wasting food, not tearing clothes, and so on and so forth. Bal Tashchis. But perhaps the greatest wanton destruction is not chopping down a fruit-bearing tree. It's not leaving a few pieces of food on the plate before throwing it in the garbage, but rather the greatest destruction a person can do is not availing themselves of their own hearts and minds, by sucking out the very soul that God breathed into them. When we're not open to learn, when we're not open to the potential, to glean what our hearts and our minds perhaps were created to do, that is Bal Tashchis. That is the greatest destruction. The Bnei Yissaschar writes that the word in this week's parsha, focusing on the mitzvah of Bal Tashchis, is ki tatsur el ir. When you go and you surround the city, talking about the mitzvah of Bal Tashchis, the word tatsur also has the word sarus, Tzadi Reish Vav Tuf, Gematria 696, says the Bnei Yissaschar. There are also 696 hours in the month of Elul. The message is clear. In order for us to change our perceived tsaros into great brachos, is to take the 696 hours that we have in the month of Elul, to be intentional about it, to be focused, to open our hearts and our minds, to not be wasteful of the spirit that God implanted in each and every one of us, and use it to grow accordingly in our connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. May this month, the month of Elul, which begins on Friday, bring us to greater and even higher heights in our relationship with Hashem, with our community, with our families, and may we be zoche to a ksiva v'chasima tova. Have a wonderful Shabbos.